Hello, and welcome to 100% Real with Ruby. Today, I have Dan Feldman on. I was really keen to get him on for a long time because he's someone who prioritizes exactly what most women ideally want, although we don't realize that we want to look like these performance athletes, these people that fuel themselves, the ones that are in the gym with this definition. And because they look so sculpted, we think that the only way there is fat loss. I'm not saying fat loss isn't a part of it. What we believe are the essentials and the priorities to get there is kind of misconstrued. And because we're not seeing the results that we want, we start to blame hormones, certain types of food, age, menopause. Maybe it's the fact that I added in an extra slice of bread. But if we can start to see what it entails to live a healthy, fit life, but to also look like someone who cares about their body and who lifts, maybe we'll stop going to all of these other things that are flashy. To be honest, the stuff that actually builds the body is boring shit. So then we start to hyper focus on what's the best high protein meal. Maybe we should be aiming for an extra 0.001 gram per kilogram of body weight in protein. I think I gave you a nice little runway to take that after your little introduction there. But what is it that you are most passionate about in your own lifting and health? And where do you see most others go wrong?
So in terms of what I'm most passionate about, pretty passionate about lifting and being as strong as I reasonably can, or at least strong enough so that I can walk day to day and kind of know that, if something happens, I can, I don't know, lift heavy groceries or help lift furniture or, and then I'm also just in a decent enough physical shape, which includes cardiovascular fitness, where if I have to like run and catch a train or something like that, I can do so. So basically being in a physical state where I can do important things if I need to and not worry about being winded or not being able to move something. That's pretty important to me. And also being confident enough in, my nutrition and fitness that I'm doing everything I can reasonably do to ensure a relatively long life and have a relatively good quality of life. That's really what's most important to me. As far as where a lot of other people go wrong, you hit on a number of things there, but I think it's following short-term kind of flashy diets or diets that have like a specific name to them. And also kind of along with that, especially, I know this kind of podcast is more so geared towards women, demonization of certain foods or certain ingredients or certain kind of ways of doing things that really come from a place of fear of like a certain food resulting in fat gain or just kind of this over sort of demonization of foods or diets or diet regimens, when in reality, for a lot of people, or within our context, a lot of women, we have a lot of flexibility in terms of what we can eat and how we can go about living our lives, where you don't have to follow this one carnivore diet or keto diet or anything like that. And that, people don't build the overall habits that allow them to enjoy their lives and have a good quality of life while still being relatively fit, looking the way they like to. So that wasn't a super straightforward answer, but hopefully it gives you at least an idea.
Yeah. And when you say that healthy life and doing it in a way that allows you to live your best life, not be something that obviously takes over it, we can come down to the same fundamental that if you are not living a physically active life, then yes, of course, especially as a woman, you're going to find that everything that you eat sticks to you, because if you're only clocking 3,000 steps a day, that takes a shit ton of your metabolism. It's not your age and it's not your hormones. Your metabolism doesn't really change all that much. It's just our lifestyles do. And then it's very easy to demonize carbs. Where exactly do people go wrong when it comes to carbs? When they're training really hard, they're wanting to look like they lift, they're wanting to boost their performance. And obviously, you're into strength training just as much as I'm into strength training and becoming the strongest we can be. A lot of women in that as well don't realize that to build the body that they want, that requires muscle. And if you're not getting stronger over time, you're not building muscle, because strength, well, not strength is muscle. Muscle is strength. You can get stronger without muscle, but muscle is strength and muscle is also lean, depending on how you go about it, because you can eat all that you want and train all that you want, and you're not going to look lean in that, but you're skipping just how long it takes to build muscle. So I guess I threw two different spanners into this, where carbs fit into this, because that's exactly what you're going to need to fuel your performance, because you're going to want to perform at your best. And while you might feel like you can perform at your best without carbs, if you go into a session and you're half asleep and you're trying to put in your best effort, it's going to feel hard. But then go into it when you're caffeinated and well fueled, and it's going to feel hard as well. But that level of absolute hard is so much greater. It's just that the relative RPE, or the relative effort, is the same. So there's that. And then I want you to bring into that just how long it takes to build muscle for women as they go through their journey, compared to how much faster the rate of fat loss is.
Right. So there's a few different pieces there. First, I think you had asked kind of what's the biggest misconception women have, or kind of what do they do wrong? And sort of like you mentioned, a lot of people, and women in particular, fear carbs, or they avoid carbs, or they try to go on ultra low carb diets because they're under the impression that carbs make you fat. And carbs do not make you fat. Eating in a calorie surplus for a long period of time makes you fat. There is nothing inherently wrong with carbs. Now, is it true that you can live and eat zero carbs? Yes, that is true, but that doesn't mean it's optimal. And for a lot of women, people differ. Women differ in terms of like what kind of diet works well for them. Some people are okay with low carbs, it's fine. But for a lot of women, kind of to your point, especially women who want to be relatively lean, they have kind of a specific aesthetic they're looking for, they want to feel good. Very often, most of the time, that entails having at least a decent amount of lean muscle mass. Doesn't mean you look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but having a solid base of muscle. Having a pretty solid base of muscle will actually make it so that you can eat more, because having muscle on you actually increases your metabolic rate. So people who have more muscle, they need more calories just to maintain their weight. And again, aesthetics is something that is somewhat subjective, but for the aesthetic that at least many women are looking after, are looking for, they think it's just really having very minimal levels of body fat, but it's being relatively lean, but also having a dense layer of muscle. And that comes from resistance training. And kind of to your point, can you make solid gains or doing resistance training and eating relatively low carbs? Sure. But especially if you're training pretty often, and especially if your training is relatively intense, having a diet with a decent amount of carbohydrates will make you feel better. It'll help you perform better in the gym. You'll just kind of feel better day to day. So that, I think, is where a lot of women fall victim to the idea that carbs make you fat, or that carbs are bad because carbs raise insulin, and one of insulin's roles is to store body fat, which is true, but that can't happen unless you're in a calorie surplus. So it's an over focus on restriction of carbs, specifically in carb-based foods. So either they aren't resistance training, or they do resistance training, but they're constantly under fueled. They feel crappy, if they are eating a very low carb diet, and that results in them not eating enough in general. Sometimes that can have downstream effects on things like thyroid hormone or estrogen levels, and depending on how restrictive the woman is, that can, sometimes result in like loss of a menstrual cycle or irregular menstrual cycles. Kind of just depends there. So that can sometimes happen, but what more often than that is that if someone follows a very restrictive diet, they try to eat like zero carbs, maybe they could do that for a few days. But if you're like most people, you're gonna, if you tell me, I'm from New York in the United States. I think you're based in Australia, but where I'm from, bagels, which your audience isn't familiar. They're like a round piece of bread. Like if you told me I could never have that again, because I'm on a low carb diet, I would immediately want them. You know what I mean? So what happens is when you tell someone or you tell yourself you can't have carbs, eventually, oftentimes it results in binging, because it's like you can never have this. So when you're at the birthday party or at the celebration where there's pizza or cake or there's chips or whatever stuff that has carbs, then they binge. And then they feel guilty from binging, and then they restrict all day, and it's this vicious binge restrict cycle. What you're better off doing is keeping a moderate amount of carbs in your diet. Obviously having some kind of common sense. We're having a diet that's largely relatively healthy, lots of low fat, lots of lean proteins, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, moderate amount of carbs, moderate amount of healthy fats, your avocados, nuts, stuff like that. Eating an amount of calories that is appropriate for your goals. And not completely eliminating these foods, because when you completely eliminate these foods, then you'll generally want them more, and it's not sustainable. My birthday's next week. I'm going to have a piece of cake on my birthday. You know what I mean? And again, carbs don't make you fat. It's being in a calorie surplus for a long period, for a prolonged period of time. I don't remember if there was another part of your question that I didn't hit on, but
going off the carbs part, if you're thinking you need to do something forever, you're not going to get to the end result, because fat loss isn't meant to be sustainable. What you need to do to lose fat is inherently unsustainable. You're not meant to live on low calories all the time. And that's the same with low carb. If you're going to dedicate or think that you're going to eat low carb for the rest of your life because it's the only way that you see results or the only way that you feel like you're making progress, do you realistically see that panning out well? Something I find, many women especially, where we respond a lot harder to things because of the way that our bodies tolerate stress. When we cut carbs or cut calories, we're on this low calorie, I call it a suppressed maintenance. You can be on a deficit calories, but not be seeing weight loss because those deficit calories aren't working for you anymore because of how you're approaching them. For example, if you're at the end of the day, it looks like deficit calories, like you balance it out to be 1,300 calories through the week, then you balance it out to be like 2,000 calories on a Saturday and then 1,800 on a Sunday, and that's meant to be your deficit. That is on paper. Physically, you're underfeeding the days of the week when you're a lot more active, when you're training. So you probably can't give your best to performance because you're not well fueled. You're probably dragging your ass through the day because you're not well fueled. When you're hungry, you kind of want to do less things. When I'm hungry, I know as a fact that I typically reserve my energy as much as I can. I'm very hyper aware of it now. But that is an example of how you can be saying that, but if I eat over 1,600 calories, I gain weight. But then there's more to that context as well, because I hear that as well. I'm going to go back to the muscle and fat loss rate thing soon, but I do hear a lot of the times, many women are like, I can't see any results unless I'm eating under 1,600 calories. What would you say to those people?
I realized I forgot to answer your question about rates of gaining muscles. Let me answer your question in terms of women who say they can't lose weight unless they eat less than 1,600 calories. So they can't see progress in progress. You're thinking of kind of more so body fat levels. That's what you're referring to.
It's more so how they perceive progress because of what we've been brought up to believe as progress. So as soon as they eat over 1,600 calories, they gain weight. Oh my goodness, this isn't good. I have to be strict on my calories and eat less.
Okay, there is a lot of different pieces there. So for one, and this is something that can be kind of controversial at times. How many calories is what's considered low calories or what's considered high calories is completely dependent on the person. I'll see some people say like, oh, less than 1,400 calories is like starvation calories, or like, oh, 3,000 calories, that's like so fattening, right? If you're comparing a 5 foot tall, 100-pound woman, what's considered a low amount of calories or high amount of calories for her will be dramatically different than a 6'5", 250-pound male. You know what I mean? So I think just generally speaking, it's very important for women listening to this to understand that your calorie needs, it's so different from person to person. How many calories is low or high? It's very dependent on the person, and it depends on what your maintenance is, which depends on a lot of factors. Depends on your body size. Smaller people tend to have a lower maintenance than larger people, both in terms of height and in terms of weight. Depends on how much muscle you have. More muscle, you generally have like a higher maintenance. And also a lot of factors you have no control over, like organ size. There's no way to control that. So that's where we have to be careful, in my opinion, of kind of saying, okay, this is the amount of calories that I should be eating. Because especially if you're using an equation like a Harris-Benedict, Mifflin-St. Jean, anything like that, it's just a ballpark estimate. But different people vary in how many calories they truly need, or what's considered low or what's considered high for them. So saying, if I eat over 1,600 calories, I start to gain weight. Well, I would need to know, okay, what is this person's maintenance? For someone who's a very small, petite female who's not very active, that might be the case. Whereas if it's not, that might not be the case. So that's kind of the first thing. And really, to truly know what your actual maintenance is, I would generally recommend, and you probably say similar things, is to actually track your intake and track your body weight for a prolonged period of time.
Well, if you're a sedentary female, and that's the
Yeah.
point. If you are listening to this and you are training your butt off, wanting to look athletic and fit, 1,600 calories is not your maintenance. So eat 2,000 calories is enough to maintain someone who's about 6'5", 5'5", 40 years old, around 60 kilos. So
Sure.
that it's like, if you're training to build muscle and you're wanting to live a healthy, fit, active life, then 1,600 calories isn't your maintenance. You're just adapted to dieting. You've only ever been taught to eat less. And weight loss is so much easier than it is to get lean, because fat loss and weight loss are completely different than lean. You can't get lean without a substantial period building muscle, which kind of leads into when you talk about muscle gain too.
Yeah, exactly. So, it depends on kind of the person and where they're at, so like your point, for a lot of women who might be listening to this, especially if it's not like they've been resistance training for that long, or, they've been chronically dieting, which is, for a lot of women is the case. In that sense, it might make sense to hold off on the goal of weight loss, unless maybe it's like very medically necessary, but at least hold off on trying to get as lean or as shredded as possible, and just try to kind of eat at like a maintenance-ish, and try to build some muscle for some period of time. It's really better for your body, especially if and again, this is where different people vary tremendously. I have to kind of keep saying that. But if there's, someone listening to this who has been chronically dieting, and, they find if they don't eat more than like a very low amount of calories, that their weight goes up, like you mentioned, they might be, like you said, kind of accustomed to, their body is kind of used to the lower calories. So when you eat very low calories, certain things, body processes can get down regulated so that your maintenance becomes very low. So that might take a period of eating a little bit more, focusing on gaining muscle, kind of allowing your body to kind of get to sort of a healthier level of calories, and focusing on building muscle, to kind of get to a place where being in a deficit would be a lot easier, like your point. So hopefully that kind of makes sense there. But again, different people's like calorie needs vary, like I said, so much from individual to individual there. And I also think that's where working with a well-experienced coach or dietitian or practitioner who can kind of give you help you be a little bit objective can be very helpful, because there's so much women and men, but especially women, body dysmorphia, where you might already be pretty lean and you're still constantly trying to lose fat, and you might need an objective pair of eyes to say, hey, you're already like, weight loss is not appropriate right now.
That is actually something that tends to be the audience that I attract, well, the clientele that I attract quite often, where I have someone who's pretty average in body size, or they're on your skinny fat kind of size, where you don't have shape. But when you're always looking to other people's metrics of progress, of course you're going to feel like you're gaining weight if you eat more food. Of course you're going to feel uncomfortable in your clothes, because now clothes can't be a metric. You're not going to feel clothes being looser on you when you're going from pretty under-muscled skinny fat to someone who wants to build muscle. Like, that takes something. And you coming from a powerlifting background, like, it's completely different from the physique world. And I realized, because I've competed at like kind of national levels for both bodybuilding and powerlifting. And it's funny because I only got my best physique after a considerable amount of time. And when I say a considerable amount of time, 3 years sitting at a body weight that was about 6 to 7 kilos, so about 12 to 15 pounds heavier, lifting heavy ass shit, building muscle, because there's no such thing as a mini bulk. And my thing is, your building cuts or your bulking cuts are just glorified yo-yo dieting. They're only going to set you up to get smaller and softer because you're not building anything in that period. And if you're still trying to play safe with calories in your bulking/building phase, what are you hoping to reveal every single time you do your deficit? That leads into the rate of weight loss. Actually, touching on the maintenance calories, because I think that part was important. When I started out, I'm someone who was very, very regimented with tracking my food because this was in my bodybuilding days. And back then, anal to the T. I was maintaining on about 1,500 to 1,600 calories. Now, of course, I was a smaller human back then, and I built quite substantial muscle since then. But I was training 6-7 days a week, and I was still only maintaining on that, and I was struggling to get any leaner. But that's where that subjective eye comes in, because I still felt like I had a lot to lose, but I didn't, as the first point. The second point is, because I was doing so much, what do you think I did the rest of the day? I was a starfish in my bed. Like, everything you do impacts other things. It's not that your body is against you in terms of age or hormones. It's how is what you're doing impacting everything else in your life. And that kind of goes on to the rate of stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and like you said, having kind of that, taking that period of time to really prioritize building muscle and building your physique will make things a lot easier in the long run. Now, as for rates, were you asking more so rates of fat loss or muscle gain?
It's both, because when you put them together, you can lose fat so much faster. Like, you can expect to lose 1 pound a week or something around that. But with muscle gain, not only is it slower the longer that you've been doing things, but you can't even expect 1 pound of pure muscle in a month. It's just that when you get that pound on the scale, there's also sarcoplasmic hypertrophy coming in. And if you look at the general lifestyle of someone who's living as a busy mom, et cetera, we're not optimizing for the optimal rates of muscle growth. So we have to take that into context as well. Whereas in a fat loss phase, that's primarily nutrition driven. When we're looking at muscle building, that is primarily training driven, and you need to eat enough to fuel it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, like you said, obviously with building muscle, by far the most important thing is the resistance training. And obviously eating enough calories and eating enough protein to fuel that resistance training and so that you can have that progressive overload and gain muscle over time. As for the rate, it depends. I don't have any kind of like firm numbers there. Women who are newer to lifting will generally be able to gain muscle more quickly than women who are already experienced. The more muscle you build, the closer you get to your genetic potential, the slower the rate of muscle gain is in general. I generally tell people not to focus too much on the rate in terms of like number of pounds of muscle per year or per week or per month, because that would be pretty difficult to quantify, but to just spend a pretty considerable amount of time. Exactly how much time, it's going to depend on the individual, but spending a considerable amount of time prioritizing muscle gain. And getting to a point where you have a few years of resistance training under your belt, where there's noticeable gains in muscle and strength. So exactly the rate, I don't know. It's going to depend on the individual. I don't have any firm numbers in terms of like number of pounds per year, like I said. But I will say you can't really force feed muscle gain, so there's no need to be in like a huge surplus in terms of calories. I think just eating enough so that you're not necessarily, unless you're already significantly overweight, that you're not losing weight, and eating a relatively high protein diet, and just doing that for a while, for, like I said, maybe 1 to 3 years to really prioritize muscle gain. Like I said, unless for women who are significantly overweight to the point that, like, from a medical perspective, there's health reasons why, it would make sense to lose weight. Otherwise, kind of prioritizing, you want to call it maintenance or gaintenance of like eating it in like maintenance or a slight surplus definitely makes sense. And, then once you have that muscle built, then if you want to lose fat, then, losing fat at a rate of, I don't know, 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week at the most. Like you mentioned, 1 pound per week. It depends on the individual, depends on how much weight they have to lose. If you have less weight to lose, then you would generally want to go slower, but it just kind of depends on the individual there. And in a fat loss phase, your main goal is, like I said, to lose fat without losing any muscle or strength. So making sure you're not losing weight too quickly, making sure you're still doing resistance training, because that's really what tells your muscles to stay put and not go away, for lack of a better term, and to eat relatively high protein throughout that time and not to be cutting forever, because that's very easy to kind of fall into that. You generally want to have a defined period throughout which you're cutting weight. And then once you're done with that, you can, whether it be maintenance or, like I said, maintenance. I think that, again, the specifics is where a good coach or practitioner comes in. Because like I said, I can speak in generalities, but a lot of these things, like how fast should you be cutting? How long should you be cutting? How many calories do you need, are very individual, specific.
I love that. And now I'm just like, no, I need to edit my last solo podcast. I almost flunked it off because when I do solos and I don't have someone to bounce off, I talk rambles and it just makes no sense. But diet breaks, you do not earn a diet break by getting to your end goal. You do not earn more calories by getting to your goal body weight or by losing X kilos. Many times, bringing your calories up allows you to endure a fat loss phase for longer and to go as hard as you need to go, because doing just like a 200 calorie deficit is not going to get you far. But if you cannot mentally and physically sustain a 400 to 500 calorie deficit, then you aren't in a place to start fat loss. Get yourself mentally in a place first so that you don't find yourself working your ass off with little results, because this is the thing. Every time you keep slashing your calories because you feel uncomfortable or you feel like you still have fat to lose, or you keep cutting forever, you're taking time away from building muscle, because muscle is expensive and you're not going to be building that in a deficit, especially when you're not optimizing for muscle gain with everything else. Because training hard and lifting heavy does not mean you're building muscle. You need patience. You need to know how to progress your program over time. And if your numbers are going up every single week, that doesn't mean you're progressing. If you are changing programs every single month, that just means just restarting over on the first week of every month. You're just getting stronger at an exercise because your brain is like, hello, I know how to fire now. And then it just does it again. I'll let you take that, because I think that's...
Yeah. And that's where really patience comes into play, which is really, really, really hard. It's not in our nature as human beings to be patient. To your point, I generally recommend people to pretty much stick with a pretty similar program for a long period of time, so you're not spending time learning new movements. Because when you introduce a new exercise into your workout regimen, there's going to be some period of time where you improve your strength on that movement just by learning the movement, like you would learn piano. There's a skill component. So keeping the exercises pretty similar, mostly similar on a week-to-week basis. The only time I would kind of have altering exercises is if someone is demotivated, and they can only be motivated if there's some variability there or some variation there. But generally keeping things pretty similar, having a pretty kind of defined period for fat loss, like you said, so you're not spending all of your time in a calorie deficit, spending more of your time, the majority of your time not in a calorie deficit. Again, unless you are significantly overweight, you have like 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds, or more like 40, 50, 60 pounds to lose, whereby there's health reasons, that's different. But if we're talking more about aesthetics, not spending a ton of time in a calorie deficit is generally a good idea, because like you said, it's going to be significantly more difficult to build muscle and make muscle and strength gains when you are in a calorie deficit. So it definitely makes sense to kind of be limited there and spend the majority of your time at like maintenance or a small surplus.
Yeah. And I will also add, because you mentioned, because I know that you come from the powerlifting background, I feel like most of my results came when I switched to that sort of training, because before, this is where that training hard and lifting heavy doesn't mean you're building muscle. I was training my ass off. I was lifting really heavy, but I was doing like 12 exercises of 4 to 6 sets in everything. And if I didn't feel like I annihilated my muscle, I do drop sets and then finishes. And that isn't allowing for progressive overload. You're fatiguing yourself. It's like, are you sending the right stimulus to the muscle? And is that a progressive stimulus over time? How much are you squatting now?
How much am I squatting now? When I squatted last week, I believe I did. I'm American, so sorry, I work in pounds. I can convert it to kilos if you want. Last week I did 417 pounds for a set of 3. And I'm 5'4" and 160 pounds, which is about 75 or 74, 73 kilos.
205 kilo squat.
Yeah, there. Is that what that is? 417 pounds?
I think that's 2.5. I have American. Most of my clients are American, so I'm used to like converting in my brain.
Okay.
But
I see a quick Google formula says 417 pounds is 189 kilos. I don't know.
Yeah, 190, probably about that. I usually divide it by 2. But
yeah, thereabouts. So for whatever that's worth, so it's decent, I think, for my body weight.
It is. That's almost 3 times your body weight. And that's the thing. Like, he didn't get to that squat by changing his program every month. And he also has muscle to show for it. And you don't build muscle, like muscle is strength. You can also get stronger without having a lot of muscle mass. So that's why you see some strength athletes and weightlifters that also don't look like they have a lot of bulk to them, because muscle is not bulky and strength is not bulky. The only reason it feels bulky, I'm not going to get into the second question yet, but this is huge. The only reason it feels bulky is because when you start lifting out, when you start lifting, there's a difference between, this is where muscle memory comes in as well, but there's a difference between muscle actual fiber growth. And this is why I say muscle weighs more than fat, because when we talk about muscles, we're talking about a whole cell. But when we're talking about actual muscle fibers, which are the ones that you want, a kilo of muscle fibers inside of a whole muscle cell is a completely different thing. And that muscle cell swells up a whole lot more when you're new to training, because it's a whole new stimulus. Now you're getting used to bringing in more glycogen, bringing in more carbs, bringing in more water. Your muscles are adapting to that. That's the only reason it feels that way. And then over time, obviously there's going to be a little bit of fat coming with that. But over time, once you spend a lot of time in the discomfort of building muscle, then once you get rid of whatever's on top, then you'll realize muscle is unbulky and you've gained a whole lot more in kilos of muscle, but your body composition is completely different. So I'll let you expand on that before I go into the next topic.
Well, just the idea of like muscle being inherently bulky.
Yeah, just that whole concept of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and then functional hypertrophy explained in more easy to digest terms. And when you train, something that I realized, maybe this can help give context. Something that I realized is that when I started training within the 4 to 6 rep range a lot more, I was able to hold on to muscle a hell of a lot more. My muscle looked a lot denser, so to speak, because I was training for that functional strength versus doing 12 to 20 reps all the time. And then I found that that kind of helped with everything else. But then, the like the 2 differences between the hypertrophies and where that all comes into.
Yeah, I think you expand. My knowledge there isn't like super, I'm a dietitian by trade, so my knowledge there isn't going to be super, super helpful. So I think you explained that just fine. Really all I would add to that is, like you said, I think the idea that lifting weights makes women bulky, a lot of that, well, it's not true. And a lot of that comes from, at least in my opinion, women who look at enhanced physique competitors, enhanced body, female bodybuilders who do have like a very bulky look. And that's more so due to the exogenous drugs and exogenous hormones, which, I mean, nothing necessarily wrong with that, but you're not gonna get kind of casually get bulky just lifting weights. It's just kind of not really how it works. Like you mentioned, if someone has a lot of body fat, then the muscle is going to be under the fat, so maybe that can create a bulky look. But for most women, again, lifting weights to have at least kind of that firm, that kind of a base of muscle is going to get them towards that goal of what probably a lot of your audience is after is kind of that lean, sculpted cut look. So hopefully that kind of makes sense.
It did. And I think that ties into the conversation we had before about carbs, because like I mentioned, carbs are drawn into the muscle, and that's why you feel like you gain weight. That's why you feel more bulky with carbs. But you also, being a dietitian by trade, you spend a lot of time debunking a crap load of stuff on Instagram. What are the 3 biggest things that you see going on right now that you want people to know?
Just related to what we were talking about, or just more generally?
In general, especially women, I would say, like the ones that would gravitate.
Okay, so this is a new one that I just heard from a client yesterday, and then someone messaged me about it. Jen Gunther, who you might be familiar with. Hopefully I'm pronouncing her name right. But apparently there was a podcast, the most popular podcast on the Spotify charts, not Joe Rogan, where there were women talking about how fasted cardio somehow makes women gain fat, or something like that. And there was no science to back that up. That's not true. I can talk about, does fasted cardio help you lose fat more than non-fasted cardio? No. If calories are equated, for the most part, no. I posted about this yesterday, but that's just something that came up yesterday. It's based on, I guess, mechanistic studies in mice, but no, fasted training is not going to make you gain fat or is not inherently harmful. If, for any woman listening to this, if you do prefer to exercise fasted, I think it makes sense to have a meal or a snack pretty soon after you train, ideally with some protein in it. But that is not a factor at all. Another one, and you know what, this is also more so relevant to your audience. There's also a myth that is, I guess, being perpetuated by a very well-known female PhD, that women need protein within an hour of exercise, that women uniquely need that. And whether women or men or whatever gender fluid, whatever, that's not the case. Like I said, if you haven't eaten, if you're working out and you're working on an empty stomach, at some point pretty soon after your workout, it makes sense to have something and have something with protein in it, just because muscle protein synthesis will be higher. But you don't have to rush right after a workout to immediately get protein. As long as your overall protein intake throughout the day is in a good spot, whether you want to do the 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo or 1.5 grams per kilo, it just doesn't make that big of a difference. But as long as your protein overall throughout the day is in a decent spot, and ideally I would say kind of spread it out somewhat throughout the day, you don't have to worry that much about the timing. You don't have to there's no studies that I know of that show women uniquely have to have protein immediately after training. And there's no good research that I've seen that fasted training is inherently harmful for women. So those are at least a couple that are, and you know what? This is again just all for your more so kind of specific to sort of your audience. Also, while obviously all women are kind of somewhat different in terms of sort of how their cycle affects them, the idea of training based on your menstrual cycle phases, so training based on the luteal phase or follicular phase, that is not based in good science. Even though I do see some people who are pretty smart with PhDs talking about that, that is not an evidence-based take. There isn't any evidence that on average, women need to train certain ways based on their menstrual cycle phase. Again, individuals might vary in terms of, certain weeks you don't have it in you, that's fine. And again, on an individual basis, that's where having a good coach kind of comes into play. So your menstrual cycle affects how you feel. It affects energy levels. It affects hunger. It affects cravings. But those are kind of really come down to the individual. And on a population level, there's no evidence that certain manners of training, certain ways of training are better in like the luteal phase, for example.
I'm going to give you one for the cycling, as the cycle syncing one as well, because I don't know if it's still big anymore, but I'll feed into that one later. But I really want to, I love how you didn't mention the doctor's name that is spreading this information about women and the way they train. And this goes to show that just because someone has doctor in front of their name and they've done research doesn't mean that what they're saying is applicable to you or even true, because people love to sensitize things and to monopolize things. And I had a podcast with Amanda Thebe on here. So
she's great.
Yeah, if you ever, she also didn't touch on this specific doctor's name. If you want to know this specific doctor, you can message either one of us. It like fasted training, yes, it's not going to amplify your muscle gain or your strength gaining, but it's not going to make you store fat. And it's that she also has this thing around sprint workouts being better than doing long form cardio, because long form cardio also makes you store fat. It's like, this stuff isn't true. And this is why the more that we try to avoid the same mundane, boring, basic shit, the more we're going to try to cling to all of these myths and think that everything's true because our body is not working the way that it should be working for the amount of effort that we're putting in. So also, I wouldn't go listening to podcasts that with advertisements and all these things to make them super huge and promoted and etc. for your fitness advice, even if they have someone like Lane Norton on it. It's like, yeah, okay, they have someone credential on it, but it doesn't mean that every other guest is credentialed. They're like, that freaking Diary of the CEO podcast does my head in. He has so many amazing guests, but then there are some that just make me want to put a red nose on my nose and wear a Ronald the McDonald wig. And anyway, the cycle syncing. I don't know whether you see it anymore, but do you see anything going around seed cycling or particular food cycling that you should eat at particular phases of your cycle? And
I haven't seen that, but I don't go searching for that right now. And I'll tell you right now that that's complete bullshit. So don't even, like I said, individual basis, some women may find they crave certain foods in certain phases, that's fine. But from a physiological standpoint, there's no evidence that certain foods you should eat during your follicular phase or luteal phase. A couple quick things. I pronounced your name wrong. I said Dr. Jen Gunther, Dr. Jen Gunter. Apologize for that. She's just DRGENGUNTER on Instagram. She's a very good, has a lot of really good information. So someone who has talked a lot about a lot of these myths, specifically kind of for women. She just posted about the fasted training. She's talked about the cycle syncing, is Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple. She's a Dr. Lauren CS1, so DRLAURENCS1 on Instagram. I just wanted to make sure I get those resources out there. And she talks a lot about, she has a paper, it's pinned on her profile, menstrual cycle phase does not influence muscle protein synthesis or whole body myofibrillar proteolysis in response to resistance exercise. If you Google what I just said, or it's on the top of her profile, it's an open access paper. She's fantastic. So definitely check her out. I'll
put them down below. I love her. She's amazing.
Yeah. So just wanted to make sure. And there's no evidence to my knowledge that, there's no evidence that having certain foods around your menstrual cycle, depending on where you are, has a difference. A lot of people just say these things because it sounds fancy. Sounds scientific. People want to hear the sexy things like, I have to do this complicated regimen. I have to do 7 leg extensions during my luteal phase, and I have to do kind of one stand on one hand and do one-legged hip thrusts during my follicular phase, because that shit sounds like unique. It sounds sexy. Me telling you to follow the same resistance training program and trying to make incremental improvements in your performance and, eating roughly at maintenance or slightly above maintenance, unless you're in a dedicated fat loss phase, and eating, 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein and, having it over like 2 to 5 eating occasions throughout the day. That stuff sounds boring. That sounds like pretty basic stuff, but it's I've posted before, I've said boring nutritional advice is usually correct nutritional advice, and that's true. So a lot of this misinformation comes from trying to make things sound sexier. And to your point about like podcasts, obviously not every piece of information from our podcast is bad. We're on a podcast right now, but I do think people need to be mindful when they're listening to, whether it be podcasts or just in general, that just because someone sounds like they're very smart or they have a PhD doesn't mean they are necessarily right. And I can think of a few. I can think of a few podcasts, very popular podcasts right now. Like where people say all kinds of things and sound very scientific. I can think of one in particular. I'm not going to say the name, but it rhymes with the Schmuberman clam. The Schmuberman collab. I'm not naming names, but like I'm saying, not like everything on that podcast is bad, but it's also kind of like entertainment, and it's very engaging. It's a very engaging podcast. The host of that podcast, who shall remain nameless, is very engaging. He's a smart dude, very, very engaging, and he's very good at making what he says sounds interesting. But, a lot of these people do go outside of their areas of expertise, and they do use mechanistic studies, like studies in mice or what have you, to say, to kind of make claims like, taking cold showers like boosts metabolism, or training based on your menstrual cycle, or I don't know, like adjusting what foods you're eating based on your menstrual cycle, or training fasted, and this protocol, that protocol, because it sounds interesting. It sounds sexy, but really to get to the body composition you want and to really live a healthy life, usually it's the boring stuff.
I love that. Yeah, it is. And the same goes for, it rhymes with Fronda hat trick.
Clatrick. Londa Clatrick. Yeah. I don't actually listen to her, but I don't really listen to any of these. And I'm not trying, to be clear, I'm not trying to throw shade at anyone. We all get things wrong. It's not like these people say nothing but bad things, but just be careful, when you're getting your where you're getting your information.
I think the most important part now that I want to end this podcast with, because it's inevitable, you're going to have injuries at some time. You're going to get sick. You're going to have setbacks, but especially injuries. And most of our injuries happen outside of the gym. Now, nutrition is something that is we can be confident in our nutrition when we're training, when we're doing our usual things. But when it comes to getting injured, there are so many conflicting things going on in our head. Like, oh my goodness, I can't perform the same way that I used to perform. Maybe you can't even perform at all for particular leg sessions, for example, if it's a knee, or you can't do just things the way they usually do it. How would you typically approach a situation where someone has some form of injury in terms of nutrition and in terms of the injury in itself, and then getting back to it with nutrition?
From a nutrition standpoint, generally, I would say eating it around maintenance. And again, unless there's like a medical obesity, like that's different, where there's like medical obesity, where someone is very, very overweight, where losing weight is like an immediate benefit to their health. Outside of that, I would generally eat it around maintenance and keep protein high. And, hopefully on the physical side of things there, whether it be physical therapy, they're still staying active and working around the injury. But I would, again, unless it's like medically beneficial, I would try to maintain weight, just to really make sure you're recovering properly.
Yeah, that's the part that I really wanted to emphasize there. Just because you're not training as hard as you used to, just because you're not doing things the way that you specifically do them, doesn't mean that you just slash your calories, because now you're not burning calories in the gym the same way. That's a very detrimental mindset to have when you're recovering, because recoveries are pretty energy costly as well. Like, you need like things there to recover. Is there anything else that you would guide people to in terms of injuries or tendons, or maybe collagen?
I'm not sure with the literature on collagen. If people want to take collagen, it's not going to hurt. Obviously, collagen is not a really great source of protein in terms of like muscle building. It's got a pretty poor amino acid profile for that. But taking collagen would be neutral to maybe slightly beneficial in terms of healing. It can't hurt. In terms of other potential supplements, I'm not aware of any that will make that dramatic of a difference. It doesn't mean there aren't. It just means there are none that I'm familiar with. There's one that I've seen a tiny bit of evidence on. It was it used to be, it's like a derivative of protein. It used to be touted like 10, 15 years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but it was like maybe a small effect. But for the most part, not really. If people want to take collagen, it's neutral to beneficial there.
That's kind of the answer I was going for. Is
Yeah.
as long as you have enough protein in your diet and you're doing as best as you can to keep your calories around maintenance, which is gonna probably come down just slightly because you're not as active, but you don't burn most of your calories in your training sessions. So if it's an injury where you can still walk the same amount, keep that in mind as well. Is there anything else that you would add to that, or?
No, not really. And just eating an overall well-rounded diet so you don't have any deficiencies. You need things like zinc, copper, magnesium, all of these things, which you should, if you're eating a well-rounded diet, you should be getting already. Oh, you know what I was thinking of? Again, I'm not sure where the evidence is at for this. HMB.
Okay.
I have no idea. That's one of those things like I've seen thrown around. And I know in the clinical contexts, like clinical, like if for like clinical dietitians, it may be beneficial, but I have no idea if that applies to like injury healing. Probably not.
Yeah, I was going to say I saw that in some clinical stuff where it was the elderly adults that benefited from it only. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, like I said, I mean, really, just if you want to take collagen, it won't hurt. Maybe it'll help your hair. I don't know. But other than that, eating plenty of protein, eating at like maintenance calories, and eating a well-rounded diet.
Yeah, no one's thriving on 1,600 calories for the rest of their life. If you're really active in training and wanting to build a body, just remember that most of the stuff that's out there isn't for someone who's really athletic and wanting to build a body. It's usually just to avoid disease. So just keep that in mind. It's like, do you want to have an optimal physique, an optimal lifestyle, an optimal amount of energy and a level of thriving? Or do you want to just fit the status quo? Because they're two different things. And same with clothes. They don't make clothes for fit athletic people. They make it for the status quo. So they're just things to keep in mind. Is there anything else that you want to tie this podcast up with? Otherwise, where can people find you? And is there anything else that you want to plug?
No, I think we covered it all pretty well. I think a big thing that, we kind of hit on, most people are never going to feel like they're lean enough. Most people who are in the fitness space still have body fat that they want to lose. And there's always going to be a part of you that wants to be leaner, and coming to a place of acceptance of that and knowing that you're never going to have the quote unquote perfect body and that's okay is really important. Just to make sure you're not constantly trying to get leaner, trying to achieve this kind of physique that you have in your head that's not necessarily attainable, or maybe it's attainable for a short period of time for bodybuilding show or a figure or whatnot. And more generally, kind of finding that happy medium where you look the way you want to and you feel good and you're healthy, but you're also enjoying your life. That you have good quality of life, because anything could happen. You never know when it's our last day until it is. So just kind of finding that balance. But other than that, it's pretty much it. People can follow me Instagram. I'm at Powerlifter Dietitian, powerlifting dietitian friend of mine. We are coming out with a nutrition course for powerlifters. So definitely be on the lookout for that. If you go to nutritionforpowerlifters.com, you will find the link to join our waitlist for that. If you're a powerlifter and you're interested in optimizing your nutrition for your powerlifting performance, it's very, very, very thorough course, and there's actually quite a bit of surprising comedy in it as well. So that's kind of the big thing we have coming up.
That sounds really exciting as well. And thank you for sharing all of that, and highly recommend following some of his myth busting on his Instagram as well, because there's a lot going out there. You don't know who to trust, and it counts to get the small amount of people that are a little bit more nuanced, but also stand true in their word, but are also willing to adjust their word upon new evidence, which is very rare out there. So thank you for listening to this podcast. Once again, it always ends with probably the best part of it all. And if you got anything from this podcast, message either one of us. let me know, and please give this a 5-star rating, and you'll hear me on the next podcast. Bye.